different because I think that someone is a very quiet area. So that you look at myself, you like that.
In 1996, 9-year-old Burke Ramsey stunned police and psychologists with his eerie calm, fleeting smiles, and vague answers about his sister JonBenét's murder. Just a kid too young to grasp the tragedy. Maybe. Yet, as an adult, his cryptic silence and chilling smirk in later interviews raise haunting questions, too unappropriated. What did Burke do or see that night, forever shrouded in the mystery of America's most baffling case? What Burke didn't say. One of the most pivotal moments in the psychological evaluation of Burke took place just weeks after the murder. On January 8, 1997, he was interviewed by Dr. Suzanne Bernard, a child psychologist, at the Children's Advocacy Center in Newitt, Colorado. The session was recorded and designed to be non-threatening, incorporating playtime to help Burke feel at ease. But what unfolded was anything but reassuring. When asked how he felt in the aftermath of his sister's violent death, Burke casually stated that he still felt safe in the home where the murder took place, an unsettling response given the gravity of the crime. Most children, when exposed to a traumatic event so close to home, exhibit fear or cling to parental protection. Burke, however, appeared emotionally disconnected. His emotional flatness was further highlighted when speaking about JonBenét. He replied with detached phrases like, "I'm fine," or simply, "Yeah," when asked if he missed her. Rather than expressing sadness or fear, he described coping with the situation by playing Nintendo, behavior some experts interpret as emotional numbing or a psychological defense mechanism in response to trauma. A drawing exercise revealed even more. In his family portrait, Burke omitted JonBenét completely. He placed his father far off to the side and drew his mother as the smallest figure. Choices that may suggest emotional distance from his parents or unresolved tension. While speculative, such symbolic omissions are often scrutinized by child psychologists as windows into a child's inner world. Perhaps most concerning was Burke's reaction when asked about inappropriate physical contact. His demeanor shifted. He placed a toy on his head, grew visibly anxious, and stated he had a secret, one he would not share. This moment, subtle but profound, left an impression on Dr. Bernard. Though there was no clear disclosure, the evasiveness and discomfort hinted at something deeper and unspoken. These behavioral observations were later compiled in the controversial Bonita Papers, an unofficial document that details aspects of the investigation, including Burke's interview. While the document's authenticity has been debated, many investigators and analysts continue to reference its content when exploring the psychological layers of the case. Together, these fragments, his strange composure, emotional disconnection, symbolic drawings, and evasive answers, paint a portrait of a boy who seemed untouched by the horror that had unfolded just steps away. Whether this was the innocence of childhood, the shield of trauma, or something far more complicated, remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the death of JonBenét Ramsey. Continuing the exploration of Burke Ramsey's psychological profile, nearly 2 decades after the murder of his sister, his reappearance in the public eye during a rare 3-part interview with Dr. Phil McGraw in September 2016 offered another opportunity for behavioral analysts to observe and evaluate his demeanor, this time not as a grieving child, but as a 29-year-old man. Unlike the 1997 session with Dr. Bernard, which was framed in a clinical, child-friendly setting, Burke's televised discussion with Dr. Phil was candid, high stakes, and broadcast to millions. It reignited the debate over his role, or knowledge, in the still unsolved case. The interview became a focal point for analysts, such as statement expert Mark Miklish and behavioral consultant David Thompson, both of whom dissected Burke's words and body language for clues that might lie beneath the surface. One of the first things noted was Burke's use of uncertain language. When recalling the last time he saw JonBenét alive, he began with phrases like, "I want to say," a formulation Miklish identified as a possible red flag. According to McClish, such tentative wording may indicate hesitation, memory issues, or even an unconscious desire to obscure information. However, when asked if he had heard any strange sounds the night of the murder, Burke gave a firm, unqualified, no. This response, lacking hedging or qualifiers, was interpreted as a truthful assertion, though it didn't dispel the broader ambiguities in his answers. More revealing was Burke's response to the question that had haunted him for years: did he kill his sister? Instead of issuing a firm denial, he sidestepped with, "Look at the evidence," or the lack of it. For McClish, this deflection stood out. Innocent individuals, he argued, typically respond with direct, unambiguous denials. Burke's decision to pivot to a broader commentary on the case's evidence struck some as intellectually evasive, rather than emotionally resolute. Equally polarizing was Burke's overall demeanor. Throughout the interview, he frequently smiled inappropriately, laughed nervously, and shifted in his seat, gestures that many viewers found unsettling. Behavioral expert David Thompson, however, cautioned against quick assumptions. Writing in a detailed LinkedIn commentary, Thompson contextualized Burke's behavior as potentially stemming from anxiety or introversion rather than guilt. As a reclusive software engineer working from home, Burke may have simply lacked the social conditioning needed to handle intense public scrutiny. Thompson drew parallels to Brendan Dassey from Making a Murderer, emphasizing that behavioral quirks, especially in introverted individuals, are often misread when filtered through the lens of suspicion. Rather than serving as a window into guilt, Burke's behavior during the Dr. Phil interview presented a mirror, reflecting the public's deep unease with ambiguity. His discomfort, inconsistent language, and emotional detachment didn't provide clarity, but they didn't offer clear evidence of wrongdoing either. Instead, they added yet another layer of psychological complexity to a case already clouded by contradictions, media spectacle, and unresolved trauma. Building upon the behavioral observations from Burke Ramsey's childhood and adult interviews, various experts in psychology, linguistics, and forensic profiling have weighed in, each offering a different lens through which to interpret his reactions, words, and emotional tone. Rather than providing definitive answers, their insights illuminate the complexity of analyzing trauma, truth, and temperament in a case still shrouded in. Dr. Suzanne Bernard, who interviewed Burke just weeks after JonBenét's death in 1997, noted his emotional detachment and unusual sense of security despite the recent tragedy. While she refrained from diagnosing any specific disorder, she suggested that Burke's subdued responses and flat affect might be signs of emotional dissociation or shock, a psychological mechanism often seen in children confronted with overwhelming trauma. In her view, these responses could reflect a subconscious effort to disconnect from the horror of what had occurred. Years later, in 2016, Burke's language during his televised appearance with Dr. Phil drew the attention of statement analyst Mark McClish. McClish pointed to Burke's vague phrasing, such as, "I want to say," when recalling the last time he saw his sister, as potentially indicative of uncertainty or concealment. More notably, when asked directly whether he had killed JonBenét, Burke avoided a clear denial, instead urging viewers to consider the evidence, or lack of it. According to McClish, this kind of sidestepping is uncharacteristic of someone who is completely innocent, who would typically respond with firm and unequivocal denial. In contrast, behavioral expert David Thompson took a more nuanced stance, cautioning against reading deception into anxiety-driven behaviors. He argued that Burke's frequent nervous smiling and fidgeting during the interview were not necessarily signs of guilt, but could be attributed to social discomfort. As a reserved individual who worked in a solitary profession, Burke's reactions may have simply reflected the stress of being placed under public scrutiny. Thompson emphasized the importance of analyzing behavior in the context of personal baseline and temperament, comparing Burke's presentation to Brendan Dassey's, a teenager similarly misread under pressure in the Making a Murderer case. Perhaps the most controversial theory came from CBS's 2016 documentary, the case of JonBenét Ramsey. A team led by former FBI profiler Jim Clemente and behavioral analyst Laura Richards proposed that Burke, in a moment of childhood frustration, may have unintentionally caused his sister's death during a conflict over a snack, citing reports of behavioral issues such as smearing feces on JonBenét's belongings and underlying sibling rivalry. The documentary posited a theory of accidental manslaughter, followed by a family cover-up. Though widely criticized and later resolved through a defamation lawsuit filed by Burke, the program nonetheless fueled public speculation and cast a lingering shadow over Burke's image. Taken together, these expert perspectives present a conflicted narrative. Burke's behaviors, his flat tone as a child, his evasive language as an adult, his awkward smiles, can be interpreted as coping mechanisms, social awkwardness, or potential signals of a deeper truth. No single interpretation is conclusive, and yet the absence of resolution continues to stir questions about what Burke truly experienced on the night of December 26, 1996. Whether he was a traumatized boy shielding himself from unbearable pain, or someone burdened by unspoken knowledge remains an unsettling uncertainty in one of America's most perplexing murder mysteries. Prior to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, several reports surfaced describing troubling behaviors exhibited by Burke Ramsey, details that would later become focal points in both media coverage and forensic speculation. According to sources such as CBS Real Crime and testimony from the family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, Burke displayed certain actions that raised concern, particularly involving his younger sister. Among the most frequently cited incidents were repeated episodes in which Burke smeared feces on JonBenét's belongings, including her bedroom walls and even her bed. Additionally, there was a reported incident in which he struck JonBenét with a golf club, allegedly leaving a visible scar on her face. These behaviors, though seemingly juvenile at first glance, were interpreted by some experts as potential indicators of deeper psychological disturbance or unresolved emotional tension. Forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz, who publicly commented on the case, pointed to such actions as possible manifestations of sibling rivalry, jealousy, or frustration, dynamics that may have been intensified by the pressures within the Ramsey household, including the attention JonBenét received from beauty pageants and the media. While these behavioral red flags have been widely discussed and debated, it's important to note that no formal psychological evaluation of Burke was ever made public prior to 1996. As such, the absence of clinical documentation leaves room for speculation, but also underscores the limitations of interpreting childhood behavior without context. Critics argue that the retrospective framing of these incidents, particularly in the wake of a national tragedy, may amplify their significance beyond what was understood at the time. Nonetheless, the accounts of Burke's early conduct remain part of the larger psychological mosaic that continues to shape theories about his role, if any, in the case. Whether these were isolated, age-related outbursts, or early signs of a deeper issue remains unresolved, adding another layer of complexity to a story already mired in contradiction and uncertainty. The psychological analysis of Burke Ramsey, drawn from his behavior during interviews and interpretations from various experts, presents a portrait marked by ambiguity and complexity. His emotional detachment, unusual sense of safety following his sister's murder, and visible anxiety in high-pressure situations could signify lingering trauma, or simply reflect innate personality traits. Dr. Suzanne Bernard and statement analyst Mark McClish observe patterns that might suggest emotional suppression or even concealed knowledge, potentially shaped by dysfunctional family dynamics. Their insights hinted at the possibility that Burke was either protecting himself psychologically or withholding critical information. In contrast, behavioral specialist David Thompson emphasized caution, arguing that Burke's nervous laughter and discomfort should not be misread as indicators of guilt. Instead, he framed these behaviors within the broader context of introversion and stress, particularly under intense public scrutiny. Meanwhile, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz and the CBS documentary The case of JonBenét Ramsey pointed to the broader possibility of intra-family involvement in the crime. However, neither provided definitive evidence tying Burke to the act itself. These theories, while provocative, remain speculative in the absence of hard proof. Importantly, no formal psychological diagnosis has ever confirmed that Burke suffers from any serious mental disorder. As a result, while the behavioral patterns surrounding him have fueled years of speculation, they remain inconclusive, blurred by the emotional trauma of the case, and complicated by limited access to primary psychological data. In the end, Burke Ramsey's conduct invites more questions than answers. Whether his behavior stems from innocence shaded by tragedy or from secrets too painful to confront, his role in America's most confounding child murder case remains elusive, part of a mystery still unresolved nearly 3 decades later. Could a 9-year-old kill? The murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains one of the most haunting and polarizing criminal mysteries in American history. On the night of Christmas 1996, the 6-year-old beauty queen was found brutally killed in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. Her cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation due to strangulation, accompanied by a severe skull fracture. Further clouding the already murky case. From the very beginning, public fascination with the case was matched only by its confusion. Nearly 3 decades later, no official suspect has been charged, and theories continue to swirl, ranging from the bizarre to the deeply personal. At the center of several of these theories stands Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother, who was 9 years old at the time of her death. Burke, along with their parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, was inside the house the night JonBenét died. Though DNA evidence eventually cleared the family as suspects in 2008, Burke's name never fully escaped public suspicion. A key thread in the alternate theory proposes that Burke may have either accidentally or intentionally caused JonBenét's death during a moment of childhood aggression, possibly followed by a family cover-up. This notion, while unproven and controversial, continues to fuel debate and scrutiny. This psychological and behavioral review seeks to explore the available facts and testimonies surrounding Burke Ramsey's actions and demeanor before, during, and after the murder, rather than rely on speculation or conspiracy. The goal is to objectively evaluate whether Burke's behavior and the known evidence align with the idea of guilt, innocence, or something far more complicated. In doing so, it connects with the broader psychological profile already discussed, inviting a deeper understanding of a young boy caught in one of America's most tragic and enigmatic crime stories. Although Burke Ramsey has never been officially named a suspect in the murder of his sister JonBenét, he has remained a central figure in the public speculation for decades. Present in the house on the night of the crime, Burke, then 9 years old, was part of the small group of people known to be inside when JonBenét was killed. Her body was found in the basement with signs of strangulation and blunt force trauma. While there was no forensic evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA, linking Burke to the nylon cord or the broken paintbrush used in the murder, the absence of any foreign footprints in the snow outside the house led some to believe the perpetrator must have been someone already inside. This alone intensified scrutiny on the Ramsey family, and particularly on Burke. A controversial theory presented in the 2016 CBS documentary, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, suggested that Burke may have struck JonBenét with a flashlight during a dispute, possibly over a late-night snack. A forensic experiment conducted during the documentary demonstrated that a child of Burke's age could have delivered a blow matching the injury JonBenét sustained. However, the flashlight in question was wiped clean of fingerprints, and no physical evidence tied Burke to it. Likewise, the ransom note left at the scene, though not linked to Burke by handwriting or prints, raised suspicions due to its unusual length and specific demand for $118,000, an amount matching John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. Some theorists saw the note as a possible attempt to cover up a domestic incident, though there is no direct evidence that Burke was involved in writing or staging it. Another point of contention came from analysis of the 911 call made by Patsy Ramsey. While she claimed that Burke had been asleep throughout the night, enhanced audio analysis of the recording suggested a child's voice, possibly Burke's, was audible in the background. If true, this would contradict the family's initial timeline and imply that Burke may have been awake and aware of the situation earlier than reported. Still, these findings were never officially validated in court. In the days and weeks after the murder, Burke was interviewed multiple times by law enforcement and a child psychologist. According to available reports, he was consistent in his statements and displayed no obvious signs of deception. Psychologists at the time concluded that the Ramsey household appeared to function with generally healthy family dynamics. However, decades later, Burke's televised interview with Dr. Phil in 2016 reignited controversy. His odd facial expressions, nervous laughter, and emotionally flat responses led many viewers to question his credibility. Some experts interpreted his behavior as symptomatic of anxiety or social discomfort, rather than guilt, while others viewed it as evasive or emotionally disconnected. The CBS documentary's suggestion that Burke may have killed JonBenét, intentionally or by accident, was met with strong denial from the Ramsey family. In response, Burke filed a defamation lawsuit against CBS, which was settled out of court in 2019. Although the settlement did not assign legal fault, it demonstrated the family's willingness to aggressively challenge any claims linking Burke to the crime. To assess the likelihood of Burke Ramsey's involvement in JonBenét's death, it's essential to examine his psychological profile and behaviors before and after the incident, as well as the physical evidence, or lack thereof, surrounding the case. Prior to the murder, reports from the family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, and investigators like Jim Clemente highlighted behaviors such as Burke's scatological tendencies, including leaving feces in JonBenét's bed and smearing it on her belongings, which some experts, like forensic pathologist Werner Spitz, interpreted as signs of psychological disturbance or sibling jealousy. Additionally, Burke's history of physical aggression, such as striking JonBenét with a golf club, leaving a scar, suggests a capacity for impulsive actions that could align with the theory of an accidental killing. The 2016 CBS documentary posited that a dispute over a late-night snack, possibly pineapple, could have escalated, with Burke striking JonBenét with a flashlight, causing her fatal skull fracture. This theory is supported by the presence of pineapple in JonBenét's stomach and Burke's fingerprints on a bowl in the kitchen, suggesting they were together shortly before her death. However, the absence of Burke's DNA or fingerprints on the murder weapon or the nylon cord used in the strangulation, combined with DNA evidence of an unmale found on JonBenét's clothing, as noted in sources like evasive and CBS News, strongly undermines claims of his direct involvement. In interviews, particularly with child psychologist Dr. Suzanne Bernard in 1997, Burke displayed an unusual lack of emotion and a sense of safety despite the murder, which some, like Clemente, found suspicious, while others, like behavior expert David Thompson, attributed to trauma or introversion. His 2016 Dr. Phil interview further fueled debate, with his evasive language and nervous laughter interpreted by language analyst Mark McClish as potential signs of withholding information, though Thompson cautioned against misreading these as guilt. The complexity of the crime scene, including the sophisticated knot used in the strangulation and the staged ransom note, suggests a level of planning beyond a 9-year-old's capacity, as discussed in Danviet. Venn and a blow dashboard. Literal. Edu. Co. Pointing to possible adult involvement if Burke played any role. The notion of intentional murder by Burke is highly improbable due to his age and lack of clear motive, as supported by Wikipedia. Org, however, an accidental scenario, such as a spontaneous act of anger, is more plausible but still speculative without concrete evidence. The family's consistent denials, legal actions against CBS, and the 2DN exoneration, as reported in a news, Bafapluit. Vinen, further complicate the narrative. Ultimately, while Burke's behaviors raised questions, the lack of forensic evidence and the psychological complexity of a child in such a traumatic situation suggests that any involvement occurred was likely accidental and would have required adult assistance to stage the scene, leaving the case mired in uncertainty as of July 18, 2025. Assessing the likelihood that a 9-year-old child like Burke Ramsey could single-handedly carry out the series of actions leading to JonBenét Ramsey's death, as well as orchestrate the complex staging to conceal the truth, requires a thorough analysis from multiple perspectives, including psychological development, practical skills, capacity to withstand pressure, and social psychological factors. To fully understand the feasibility of this hypothesis, each of these aspects must be examined in detail. Firstly, from a physical and motor skills standpoint, inflicting serious injury such as striking the victim's head with a heavy object and tying intricate knots with nylon cord demands a level of fine motor coordination and physical strength that experts agree is unlikely for a child under 10 years old. Furthermore, the steps involved in managing the crime scene, binding the victim, positioning the body, composing an elaborate ransom note, and eliminating evidence require strategic thinking and an understanding of legal consequences, abilities that a child at that age typically does not possess. Psychologically, 9-year-old children generally have not fully developed the emotional regulation or complex logical reasoning skills found in adults. Maintaining a significant secret, coping with guilt, fear, or family pressure over an extended period requires exceptional maturity, which is rare at such a young age. The psychological strain of living in an environment filled with secrecy, concealment, and constant adult surveillance could lead to dissociative behaviors or emotional disturbances, but it is improbable for a child to both commit the act and systematically organize its cover-up. Moreover, if Burke did accidentally or intentionally cause his sister's death in a moment of childhood anger or conflict, it is highly likely that adult assistance or protection within the family would have been necessary to prevent legal repercussions. This assistance might include staging the crime scene, drafting a lengthy and complex ransom letter, and fabricating signs of sexual assault. Such actions require basic legal knowledge, the ability to manipulate investigators psychologically, and the savvy to control behavior, capabilities well beyond what a child could achieve independently. Excluding the possibility that Burke was the direct perpetrator leads to the pressing question: who could the real killer be? Burke saw the truth. Following the murder on December 25, 1996, her brother, Burke Ramsey, then 9 years old, was interviewed multiple times by police and psychologists to gather insights into the events surrounding the tragedy. The key interviews included one with Detective Fred Patterson on December 26, 1996, just hours after the discovery of JonBenét's body, and another significant session on January 8, 1997 with Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, a child psychologist retained by the Boulder Police Department. Additional interviews were conducted by Dr. John McCann and other investigators in 1997 and 1998 with psychologists like Dr. Bernhard playing a critical role in creating a safe environment for Burke to share his recollections. These conversations, marked by Burke's age, appropriate responses and occasional speculation, have fueled ongoing debates about his knowledge of the crime and the influence of media or family discussions on his statements. The conversation between Burke Ramsey and Dr. Bernhard, conducted on January 8, 1997, just over a week after the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, has been a focal point for those analyzing the case. During this interview, Burke was questioned about what he knew regarding his sister's death. His responses, as documented by James Kohler and others, have sparked intense debate, particularly because of the details he provided and those he omitted.
Yeah, I think someone is a very quiet and goes back and
Burke's claim that he knew what happened initially seemed striking, but context suggests he was referring to the fact that his sister was murdered and her body was found in the basement, a detail his father had shared with him. When asked by Dr. Bernhard how he thought JonBenét died, Burke speculated that someone took her to the basement and possibly used a knife or a hammer. These theories, particularly the mention of a hammer, have drawn attention because JonBenét's autopsy revealed a severe head injury caused by a blow to the skull. However, Burke's failure to mention strangulation, a detail widely reported in the media by the time of the interview, has puzzled investigators like James Kohler. Boulder newspapers had published accounts of JonBenét's strangulation, making it common knowledge in the community. Kohler found it notable that Burke did not reference this in his conversation with Dr. Bernhard, raising questions about whether he was deliberately withholding information or simply unaware of the full extent of the injuries. The media's role in shaping Burke's knowledge is a critical point of contention. By January 8, 1997, news outlets had reported extensively on JonBenét's death, including the fact that she was strangled. However, early reports on January 6, 1997, also mentioned her head injury, specifically a skull fracture. This raises the possibility that Burke's reference to a hammer could have stemmed from these reports. Yet, his inclusion of a knife as a possible weapon complicates the narrative. Initial media coverage explicitly stated that JonBenét was not stabbed, which makes Burke's speculation about a knife curious. Kohler questions why Burke would combine these two methods, stabbing and striking, if he had accurate knowledge of his sister's injuries. One possibility is that Burke was simply guessing, piecing together fragments of information he had heard from adults, media, or other sources. Children often process traumatic events through a mix of imagination and overheard details, which could explain his inconsistent narrative. Another theory posits that Burke's speculations might have been influenced by unrelated cases or stories he encountered. For instance, Burke might have overheard discussions about a 1984 Colorado killer who used both a knife and a hammer in his crimes. If Burke, as a young child, caught snippets of such a story on television or in adult conversations, he might have conflated it with his sister's murder, assuming similar methods were used. This is purely speculative, but it highlights how children can absorb and reinterpret information in unpredictable ways. Burke's age at the time, 9 years old, further complicates the analysis. Young children are not typically avid consumers of news, and their understanding of events is often filtered through what they hear from adults or media exposure. It's possible that Burke's comments reflect a mix of what he was told by his father, what he gleaned from the media, and his own attempts to make sense of the incomprehensible. There is a narrative that has long surrounded the Ramsey case, the idea that someone within the family might have been involved, or at least aware of more than they disclosed. However, this interpretation assumes a level of calculation that may not align with the behavior of a 9-year-old processing a traumatic event. Burke's mention of the head injury aligns with media reports, which could support the argument that he was simply repeating what he had heard. Conversely, his failure to mention strangulation, despite its prominence in the news, could suggest either ignorance of the details or an intentional omission, though the latter seems less likely given his age and emotional state. Interestingly, there is evidence that Burke was aware of the strangulation prior to the interview with Dr. Bernhard. Just days earlier, he had recounted the events to his friend Doug Stein in a way that reportedly alarmed his mother. This raises further questions about why he did not mention strangulation to Dr. Bernhard. One explanation could be that Burke was reluctant to discuss the more gruesome details of his sister's death, either out of fear, confusion, or a desire to avoid the topic. Alternatively, his focus on the head injury and the knife could reflect the fragmented way in which children process information, especially under the stress of a formal interview. The inconsistencies in his account, mentioning the head injury but not the strangulation, speculating about a knife despite media reports to the contrary, could simply indicate a young boy grappling with a tragedy beyond his comprehension. Another concerning evidence, the flashlight found on the Ramsey family's kitchen counter, stands as one of the most enigmatic pieces of evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case. A black mag light, it was discovered in a prominent, almost staged position, upright and conspicuous amidst the clutter of a messy kitchen. What makes this flashlight particularly intriguing is the complete absence of fingerprints, not only on its exterior, but also on the batteries inside. Investigators noted that both the flashlight and its batteries appeared to have been deliberately wiped clean, a detail that immediately raises suspicions of intentional misdirection. This lack of fingerprints aligns the flashlight with another key piece of evidence, the ransom note, which also bore no traceable prints, suggesting that someone took great care to obscure their connection to these items. Initially, John and Patsy Ramsey seemed to recognize the flashlight, with Patsy vaguely recalling it as a gift from John's son, John Andrew, possibly for use in his plane or for other purposes. However, their story shifted over time, as they later claimed the flashlight did not belong to them. This contradiction is compounded by the fact that the drawer where John's flashlight was typically stored was found open, with no flashlight inside, implying that their own flashlight might have been removed or replaced. The Ramseys' inconsistent statements, coupled with their suggestion that the flashlight in the kitchen was foreign to their home, fuel speculation that they were attempting to distance themselves from this object, perhaps aware of its significance in the investigation. The flashlight's placement in the kitchen, far from its usual storage spot near the bar area, adds another layer of mystery. Its conspicuous position, standing erect rather than casually discarded, seems almost designed to draw attention. Many investigators and analysts have theorized that a flashlight was intended to be seen as the potential murder weapon, capable of inflicting the fatal head wound JonBenét suffered. Yet, some argue this is a deliberate red herring, meant to divert attention from the true weapon, possibly a softball bat linked to Patsy or Burke Ramsey's recreational activities. The flashlight's prominence in the kitchen could also serve to misdirect investigators toward that area of the house, away from the basement where JonBenét's body was ultimately found. In interviews with law enforcement, Patsy's responses about the flashlight were marked by vagueness and contradiction. When shown a photo of the flashlight on the kitchen counter, she hesitated, claiming uncertainty about whether it was theirs, even as she described a similar, big black flashlight John owned. Her inability to definitively identify the flashlight, combined with her offhand remarks about its usual storage in a drawer, contrasts sharply with John's more calculated responses. John acknowledged owning a similar maglite, but suggested it typically didn't work due to dead batteries, further muddying the waters. This discrepancy between their accounts, Patsy's apparent amnesia and John's selective clarity, raises questions about whether they were intentionally obfuscating the flashlight's origins and purpose. Take a look at more disturbing aspects. The investigators, particularly Haney, a seasoned Denver police detective who conducted Patsy Ramsey's June 1998 interview, appeared focused on two distinct knives linked to Burke Ramsey, not just the red knife engraved with his name. Haney's line of questioning suggested the police were pursuing evidence of a second knife, separate from the well-known Red Scout Nafi Ramsey recalled purchasing in Switzerland. Patsy, however, seemed to recall only the engraved knife, vaguely mentioning a small knife with a keychain, but quickly dismissing it to emphasize the red one. This shift in her account raised suspicions, as it hinted at possible evasion or selective memory. Burke, in contrast, explicitly acknowledged possessing another knife, which he admitted using to fashion knots, a critical detail given the technical knots found at the crime scene involving JonBenét. The Red Scout knife, described by the housekeeper Linda Hoffman-Pugh as a multi-tool typical of Boy Scouts, was reportedly confiscated by Hoffman-Pugh after Burke's uncontrolled whittling. She hid it in a small cupboard just outside JonBenét's room after Thanksgiving, a location significant for its proximity to the victim. This placement suggested that anyone familiar with the house could have accessed it quickly, raising questions about who might have retrieved it and for what purpose. The Scout knife's association with skills like knot tying, learned through Burke's Boy Scout activities, further amplified its relevance, as the knots used to bind JonBenét were notably complex and not easily replicated. Patsy's responses during questioning added to the ambiguity. When pressed about a second knife, she deflected, claiming no memory of it despite Burke's clear admission. Her vague reference to a keychain knife, followed by a focus on the Swiss knife, contrasted with her reaction to a knife found in the basement near the crime scene, which she called unusual, without explaining why. This was inconsistent, as her awareness of the hidden knife near JonBenét's room should have made the basement knife less surprising. Her reluctance to acknowledge the second knife, coupled with her casual remark that she didn't know what to do beyond confiscating Burke's knife, suggested possible withholding of information. Hoffman-Puig's account further complicated the narrative. Frustrated by Patsy's lax oversight, she took it upon herself to hide the knife, noting Patsy's dismissive response. "I don't know what to do except take it away." This highlighted a lack of parental control and raised a critical question. If the knife was secured, how did it end up in the basement? The possibility that the second knife, potentially the one Burke used for knot tying, was the one found in the basement, added a layer of suspicion, as its presence near the crime scene could tie directly to the murder's physical evidence. Burke's admission about using a knife to fashion knots stood out as a pivotal, but underexplored detail. This skill, likely honed through his Boy Scout training, directly connected to the sophisticated knots found on JonBenét, contradicting Patsy's claim that Burke had no need for such a tool. The discrepancy between Burke's forthrightness and Patsy's evasiveness fueled speculation about what might have been concealed. Whether the second knife was the small keychain knife Patsy briefly mentioned or another tool entirely, its potential link to the crime scene knots and its mysterious relocation to the basement underscored its significance in the investigation. Let's come with the bowl of pineapple found on the dining room table stands as a haunting piece of evidence. Its significance amplified by the fingerprints of both Burke and Patsy Ramsey on it, and the presence of pineapple in JonBenét's small intestine. This seemingly innocuous item, a simple bowl of fruit, carries a weight that belies its mundane appearance, suggesting a critical moment in the timeline of that tragic night. During Burke Ramsey's June 1998 interview with Detective Dan Schuler, the bowl of pineapple became a focal point, not just for its physical presence, but for the way Burke reacted when confronted with its image. His response, or lack thereof, offers a window into the psychological undercurrents of the case, raising questions about what he knew and what he might have been coached to avoid.
Can you describe that to me?
Something. Right. It's like glass with a tea bag in it.
When Schuler presented Burke with a photograph of the dining room table, prominently featuring the bowl of pineapple, Burke's reaction was striking in its hesitancy. Instead of directly acknowledging the bowl, he described the image vaguely, calling it simply the dining room table. His pause was palpable, described as a pregnant pause, followed by an audible "oh," that carried the weight of a gasp or a moment of recognition. This wasn't just a child stumbling over words. It was a moment charged with tension, as if Burke was grappling with how to navigate the question. His body language further betrayed his discomfort. He fidgeted, rubbing his arm with his other hand, and let out a nervous chuckle that felt out of place. This inappropriate laughter, coupled with his reluctance to mention the pineapple explicitly, suggests a deeper awareness of the bowl's significance, perhaps something he was instructed to sidestep. The gravity of Burke's reaction becomes even more compelling when viewed against the physical evidence. The bowl bore his and his mother's fingerprints, and the pineapple in JonBenét's digestive system indicated she had eaten it shortly before her death. This places Burke and JonBenét potentially together at the dining table that night, contradicting his earlier claim that he last saw his sister asleep in the car or heading up the stairs. His evasive response to the photograph, focusing on the table rather than the bowl, feels like a deliberate attempt to distance himself from the scene. The nervous laughter and fidgeting could indicate a child caught off guard, aware that the pineapple is a loaded topic, but unsure how to deflect without drawing suspicion. It's a moment that feels rehearsed, yet raw, as if Burke was trying to adhere to a script while grappling with the weight of the truth. What makes Burke's reaction to the pineapple so intriguing is its consistency with his behavior years later. In his 2016 interview with Dr. Phil, he displayed a similarly inappropriate smile when discussing his sister's death, a quirk that echoes the nervous chuckle from 1998. This pattern suggests a discomfort with certain topics, particularly those tied to physical evidence like the pineapple. The bowl isn't just a piece of fruit on a table. It's a tether to a moment that could unravel the Ramsey family's narrative. Was Burke coached to avoid mentioning the pineapple? His defensive posture and vague answers point to that possibility, especially when juxtaposed with the police theory that JonBenét's consumption of the pineapple might have sparked a confrontation, perhaps trivial in the eyes of an adult, but monumental in the volatile emotions of a child. The idea that JonBenét stole a piece of pineapple, as one theory posits, seems far-fetched on its face, but within the context of a household where JonBenét's pageant stardom commanded disproportionate attention, such a small act could have been perceived as a slight, fueling resentment. Overall, Burke's responses during this 6-hour, 3-day interrogation, conducted in the presence of his attorney Jim Jenkins, have been scrutinized for signs of rehearsal, particularly given the high-stakes nature of the investigation and the Ramsey family's robust legal defense. The possibility that Burke was prepped by his parents or legal team to navigate sensitive questions raises significant implications about the reliability of his statements and the broader narrative crafted by the Ramseys. His demeanor, responses, and the context of the investigation provide compelling clues about whether he was guided to present a specific version of events. Burke's assertion that he was not coached by his parents or anyone else before the interview is a starting point, but it invites skepticism when viewed through the lens of the Ramsey family's legal strategy. The family was represented by a formidable team of attorneys, and the presence of Jim Jenkins during Burke's interview suggests a carefully controlled environment. The FBI's concern, as noted in the investigation's records, was that re-interviewing the Ramseys with their lawyers present risked revealing critical evidence, allowing the family to tailor their responses. This fear extended to Burke, a 9-year-old at the time of the crime, whose statements could either corroborate or undermine his parents' accounts. Burke's claim of not being coached, delivered in a defensive tone, as described by author Lauren Schiller, feels rehearsed in itself, a child's attempt to deflect suspicion. The fact that he was accompanied by an attorney during the interview, a precaution not typically afforded to children in less high-profile cases, suggests that the Ramsey family anticipated scrutiny and prepared accordingly. The dynamics of the Ramsey household further support the likelihood of coaching. John and Patsy Ramsey were under intense suspicion, and their legal team had a vested interest in ensuring that Burke's statements aligned with their narrative of an external intruder. Burke's defensive posture, noted by Schiller as typical for a child, but potentially excessive in certain moments, hints at a child who was aware of the gravity of the questions and the need to tread carefully. His answers often seemed calculated to avoid incriminating details, such as when he was asked about general events of the night JonBenét died, sticking to vague recollections rather than offering specifics that might contradict his parents' story. This restraint is unusual for a child, unless they have been guided to avoid certain topics. The Ramsey family's reluctance to allow unmonitored interviews, evidenced by the Boulder Police Department's Jane Harmer being barred from observing the sessions, and the tapes being shipped overnight for review, further suggests that Burke's responses were part of a broader strategy to control the flow of information. Moreover, the broader context of the investigation reveals a pattern of obfuscation that likely extended to Burke's preparation. District Attorney Alex Hunter's hesitation to bring the Ramseys before a grand jury without their attorneys, as described in the source material, indicates a protective stance that could have facilitated coaching. The FBI's frustration with Hunter's decision underscores their belief that the Ramseys were being shielded, potentially allowing time to align their stories, including Burke's. His ability to maintain a consistent narrative that he was asleep during the events and unaware of any wrongdoing aligns too neatly with his parents' account to be entirely spontaneous. Children, even those as young as Burke, can be coached to stick to a script, especially when the stakes involve protecting family members or avoiding legal consequences. The fact that Burke's interview was carefully orchestrated, with attorneys and advisors shaping the process, suggests that he was likely briefed on how to handle questions, even if he denied it. However, it's worth considering that Burke's defensiveness could also stem from the natural trauma of losing his sister and being thrust into a high-pressure investigation. A child in such circumstances might instinctively avoid certain topics out of fear or confusion, without explicit coaching. Yet, the consistency of his responses, the presence of legal counsel, and the Ramsey family's sophisticated legal defense tilt the scales toward the likelihood of preparation. Burke's guarded answers, coupled with the family's efforts to control the investigative process, paint a picture of a boy who was not only aware of the case's implications, but likely guided to present a version of events that protected the family's narrative. While definitive proof of coaching remains elusive, the circumstantial evidence, his defensive demeanor, the controlled interview environment, and the Ramsey family's legal strategy strongly suggests that Burke was prepared to navigate the interrogation with care, ensuring his responses aligned with a carefully constructed defense. As a victim. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, the hypothesis that the events leading to her death could be linked to a scenario involving playing doctor has been raised as a possible explanation, particularly when considering the involvement of her brother, Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time. This theory draws from the broader understanding of playing doctor, a term used to describe a common childhood behavior, where children, typically between the ages of 3 and 6, explore each other's bodies out of natural curiosity, often under the guise of pretending to be a doctor and patient. While this behavior is generally considered a normal part of childhood development when consensual and age-appropriate, the Ramsey case introduces a darker interpretation, suggesting that what might have started as innocent play could have escalated into a tragic incident. Playing doctor hypothesis, when applied to this case, is complicated by the violent nature of JonBenét's death and the specific evidence, such as the paintbrush injury, which points to a scenario far removed from harmless curiosity. The idea that Burke and JonBenét might have engaged in a game resembling playing doctor stems from the context of their close sibling relationship and the unsupervised moments that could have occurred in the Ramsey household on the night of the murder. Child psychologists, as noted in studies like Alfred Kinsey's 1948 work, suggest that up to 38.6% of children around age 10 engage in such exploratory play, driven by curiosity about anatomical differences. In the Ramsey case, this hypothesis posits that Burke, as a young boy, might have initiated such a game with his 6-year-old sister, perhaps unaware of the boundaries or consequences. However, the presence of the paintbrush, used in a manner that caused severe injury, immediately distinguishes this scenario from typical playing doctor behavior. The deliberate and harmful nature of the act suggests a level of intent or aggression that aligns more closely with child-on-child sexual assault than innocent exploration, raising questions about whether Burke's actions, if he was involved, were influenced by external factors or underlying psychological issues. Playing doctor hypothesis is further complicated by the Ramsey family's dynamics and the intense scrutiny they faced. JonBenét, as a child beauty queen, was the center of attention, which could have created feelings of rivalry or resentment in Burke, who was often overshadowed by her pageant activities. Some theories speculate that a game of playing doctor could have been a way for Burke to assert control or curiosity, but the escalation to violence, evidenced by the paintbrush and the fatal head injury, suggests something far more serious. The absence of clear evidence that Burke and JonBenét were engaged in such play that night, combined with the family's guarded responses during interviews, fuels speculation but lacks definitive proof. For instance, Burke's defensive demeanor during his 1998 interview, as described by Lauren Schiller, could indicate discomfort with topics related to his sister's body or their interactions, but it could also reflect the natural anxiety of a child under investigation. Moreover, Burke Ramsey is believed may have been a victim of abusing adds a deeply troubling layer to the already complex JonBenét Ramsey case. This theory, suggested by the concerning behavioral and medical indicators observed in both Burke and JonBenét, posits that Burke's troubling actions, such as the reported smearing of feces, could be symptomatic of a child who has experienced trauma, potentially including abuse. The Ramsey family's fierce protection of Burke's medical records, which were kept under strict confidentiality despite his young age of 9 at the time of the murder, fuels speculation that these records might contain evidence of abuse or psychological issues that could contextualize his behavior and role in the case. The possibility that Burke was a victim of assault raises questions about the family dynamics, the environment in which the children were raised, and whether such trauma could have contributed to the tragic events surrounding JonBenét's death. Burke's reported behavior, particularly the act of smearing feces, is a significant red flag in the context of child psychology. This behavior is statistically associated with children who have experienced severe stress or trauma, including abuse. Such actions are often a nonverbal expression of distress, especially in young children who lack the ability to articulate complex emotions or traumatic experiences. The fact that both Burke and JonBenét exhibited concerning behaviors, JonBenét with persistent bedwetting, encopresis, and recurrent vaginal infections, and Burke with fecal smearing, suggests a household environment that may have been conducive to, or reflective of abuse. The combination of these symptoms in two siblings is described as statistically alarming, pointing to a pattern that is unlikely to be coincidental. If Burke was a victim of assault, this trauma could have manifested in behaviors that were misinterpreted or overlooked by those around him, including the family's trusted pediatrician, who was a close friend and denied evidence of abuse. The Ramsey family's insistence on keeping Burke's medical records sealed intensifies suspicion about what those records might reveal. At just 9 years old, Burke's medical history would not typically require such stringent protection unless it contained sensitive information with potential relevance to the case. If Burke had been subjected to assault, his medical records could document physical or psychological indicators, such as signs of trauma, behavioral disorders, or therapy sessions, or theracing his fecal smearing or other issues. The family's legal team, aware of the scrutiny on Burke as a potential suspect, might have fought to keep these records private to prevent them from being used to construct a narrative of Burke as a troubled child capable of harming his sister. However, this secrecy also suggests the possibility that the records could point to Burke as a victim, which would shift the focus toward identifying a perpetrator within or close to the family circle, potentially an adult who had access to both children. Based on Burke's oddities and those of John and Patsy, a theory has been developed that can reconcile the contradictions that persist throughout the case. The hypothesis that Burke Ramsey, as a 9-year-old, played a pivotal role in the tragic death of his sister, JonBenét Ramsey, hinges on a chilling sequence of events, driven by a spontaneous act of violence and a calculated cover-up orchestrated by their father, John Ramsey. According to this theory, the night began innocently enough with the Ramsey family returning from a Christmas party at the Whites' home. Burke, restless and perhaps eager to play with his new toys, ventured downstairs to snack on pineapple, a detail supported by the bowl found on the dining room table bearing his and his mother Patsy's fingerprints. JonBenét, hearing her brother, joined him, and the two shared a moment snacking together. However, the situation escalated when JonBenét, perhaps pestering Burke as he played with his trains in the basement, provoked his frustration. Burke, described as having behavioral issues, tied to neglect from Patsy's focus on JonBenét's pageant career and the distant presence of John, grabbed an object, possibly the flashlight, and struck JonBenét on the head. This impulsive act, not intended to kill, left her unconscious, prompting a terrified Burke to alert his parents, setting the stage for a complex and sinister cover-up. Burke's role in this hypothesis is central, but limited to the initial act of violence. As a young boy with documented behavioral challenges, including a prior incident involving a golf club and reports of fecal smearing, Burke's reaction to his sister's provocation aligns with a child struggling with anger and emotional neglect. After striking JonBenét, he attempted to rouse her, possibly poking her with train tracks in a desperate bid to wake her, before running to his mother for help. At this point, Burke's involvement in the physical act ends, as his parents took over. John, realizing the gravity of the situation and the risk of an autopsy revealing prior abuse he had inflicted on JonBenét, swiftly devised a plan to protect himself by implicating Patsy. Burke was instructed to return to his room and remain there, effectively removing him from the subsequent staging. His simple alibi, that he was asleep all night, was easy for a child to maintain, requiring minimal coaching and aligning with John's own narrative of being unaware until Patsy's scream. This simplicity ensured Burke's story remained consistent, even under scrutiny during his 1998 interview, where his discomfort surfaced only when confronted with unrelated evidence like the pineapple. The hypothesis paints Burke as an unintentional catalyst rather than a mastermind, his actions driven by a moment of childish impulsiveness rather than malice. John exploited this incident to shield himself from abuse allegations, manipulating Patsy into believing they were all at risk if Burke's act was discovered. Burke's behavioral issues, potentially exacerbated by the family's dysfunctional dynamics, Patsy's obsession with JonBenét's pageants and John's emotional distance, provide context for his outburst. However, the theory suggests that Burke was unaware of the full scope of the cover-up, including the staging of the body and the ransom note. His role was confined to the initial strike, after which John took control, ensuring Burke's involvement remained minimal and his story straightforward. The sealed medical records, fiercely protected by the Ramsey legal team, might contain evidence of Burke's psychological struggles, potentially linked to his own victimization or emotional turmoil, further complicating his role, but not extending it beyond the initial act. Burke's limited agency in this hypothesis underscores the tragic manipulation at the heart of the Ramsey case. While he is posited as the one who struck JonBenét, the real orchestrator was John, who used Burke's actions to deflect suspicion onto Patsy. The theory suggests Burke was not coached extensively, as his alibi was deliberately simple to avoid slip-ups, but his nervous reaction during the 1998 interview, particularly when shown the pineapple photo, hints at an awareness of the night's events, even if he was instructed to deny involvement. The pineapple incident, where he hesitated and fidgeted, reveals a child caught off guard, possibly recalling the moment he and JonBenét were together, but adhering to the directive to claim he was asleep. This hypothesis frames Burke as a troubled child whose impulsive act set off a chain of events, but his role was quickly overshadowed by John's calculated efforts to protect himself, leaving Burke as both a perpetrator of the initial blow and a pawn in a larger scheme to frame Patsy for the crime. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains a haunting puzzle, with theories like Burke's involvement or John's manipulation offering compelling narratives, but no definitive truth. The key lesson from this tragedy is the fragility of speculation. No matter how rational or evidence-based a hypothesis appears, it remains conjecture without concrete confirmation. The intricate web of clues, pineapple, paintbrushes, or ransom notes, fuels endless debate, yet none provide the irrefutable proof needed to close the case. Each theory, while logically constructed, risks oversimplifying a complex human tragedy, potentially vilifying individuals without just cause. Until a confession or undeniable evidence emerges, Burke and the Ramsey family are, at their core, victims of a horrific loss and relentless public scrutiny. The case underscores the dangers of rushing to judgment, reminding us that speculation can obscure compassion. It teaches us to prioritize empathy for those entangled in unresolved grief, like Burke, who lost a sister, and a family forever shadowed by suspicion. Without truth, we must resist the urge to cast blame, acknowledging that the real answers may remain forever out of reach.